Welcome to Building the Future, Freedom, Prosperity, and Foreign Policy, a podcast series focused on updating the United States soft power playbook to meet the hopes and aspirations of developing countries because it's in America's interest to do so. I'm Dan Rundy, Senior Vice President at CSIS. There are a lot of global challenges out there, so let's get started.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Building the Future. I am Romina Bandura, a Senior Fellow on the CSIS Project on Prosperity and Development. I'll be your guest host today, filling in for Dan Rundy. Today, I'm joined by Jamie Zimmerman, the Deputy Director of Digital Connectivity at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Jamie joined the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 2017 and now leads the foundation's work to close the gender digital divide and accelerate meaningful digital connectivity to improve the lives and livelihoods of women and girls around the world. Her career focuses on increasing women's economic empowerment through access to and use of digital financial services. I'm podcasting Jamie today to discuss the role that digital technologies play in women's economic empowerment. I hosted Jamie at a CSIS event on this topic in March of this year, and I look forward to diving deeper into the conversation we had a few months ago. Jamie, welcome back, and thank you for joining me today.
Good to see you again, Romina. Thanks for having me here.
Of course. So let's warm up a little bit. And I want to kick off the conversation with describing a little bit how you ended up, on this exciting role, and tell the audience a little bit about your career.
Okay, the great how did I get here question. Okay, I'm going to try my best, Romina, to make a bit of a long story short for you and the listeners. It's about a 20-year-long story. Where do I begin? So I've spent the last years, like literally last 20 years, my entire career working on policy and innovation for equity, inclusion, and empowerment, kind of full stop. So after finishing university and graduate studies in international economics and development, I spent a few years in academia studying the intersection of trade and human rights policy. And then in 2006, Muhammad Yunus won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in microfinance and financial empowerment. And those concepts at that time really resonated with me and honestly still do on a very deep level. And so I decided to shift gears from the macro to the micro and moved over to a think tank in DC called New America and started up a new program focused on policy and product research, innovation in global financial inclusion and asset building for the poor. And basically from that point on, I never looked back. And after many years at New America, I did a 5-year stint in independent consulting, as many women do when their children are very, very young. I worked with the World Bank, IFC, World Food Program, Better Than Cash Alliance, the UN, the G20, all on financial inclusion and digital financial inclusion for development. And then in mid-2017, I joined the Gates Foundation, and I've been there for now almost 7 years. So my first role at the Gates Foundation was to lead the Global Strategic Partnerships portfolio for what is now called the Inclusive Financial Systems team. So the team that's focused on financial services and financial inclusion. And in 2019, so a couple of years after starting that role, I shifted my portfolio entirely over to women's financial inclusion and economic empowerment. Around about a year before that, the foundation launched their first kind of foray into gender equality, and women's economic empowerment was a central part of that first phase. And so I was very excited to get the opportunity to support the Inclusive Financial Systems team to lead that up. In that role, we developed this really ambitious North Star vision to close the gender gap in digital financial services completely by 2030. And through that process of developing that strategy, I got to see very quickly that our ability to achieve that goal would be severely compromised by the gender digital divide. Mm-hmm. And yet, it wasn't, quote unquote, as we say in the foundation, on strategy for that team, the Inclusive Financial Systems team, to solve for the gender digital divide. We're solving for financial inclusion.
Right.
And so two things became very clear to me very quickly. One was that we are leaving growth opportunity and impact on the table every day that there's a gender gap in access to and productive uses of digital tools and systems. And the second was that meaningful connectivity and productive usage of digital tools is critical to achieving all kinds of other goals that need urgent achieving, including strategic goals like financial inclusion, but also health goals like maternal, newborn, and child health, primary healthcare delivery, et cetera. So in 2022, when the foundation launched its gender equality division as like a full-fledged division at the foundation for the first time, and announced that it was going to launch a learning agenda to understand what we could be doing better to accelerate closure of the gender digital divide, and offered me the incredible opportunity of helping to build and lead it. I jumped at that opportunity. So now it's been 2 years, and I feel super lucky and motivated and excited every day that I get to do this work on behalf of the foundation.
Wonderful. Can you explain a little bit how your programming works? I mean, we talk about the gender digital divide, but do you guys fund things like connectivity? Do you fund infrastructure, or is it more, that you fund things like women's access to IDs, the digital public infrastructure? So tell us a little bit about the programming and women's economic empowerment and how it relates, to the digital tools.
Yeah, it's a super great question. And let me explain how it all works at the foundation, because there's my work on digital connectivity as a learning agenda. And then there's the rest of the work that's happening at the foundation on digital systems and digital tools and how that links in. But maybe I could take a step back first, because I think it might be really helpful to motivate the problem that we're trying to solve for your listeners. And it just so happens that this week, one of our partners, the GSMA, released their annual mobile gender gap report. So we have fresh new data on what is the gender digital divide and what's happening in its either expansion or narrowing. So I'd love to share just like the latest, a couple of things, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about what we're doing about it. So here goes. What we know from the data that was released this week by GSMA is that the gender gap in mobile ownership remains unchanged since 2020. So women in low and middle income countries are 8% less likely than men to own a mobile phone. 405 million women still do not have a mobile phone. But there is some good news. After 2 straight years of either no or negative movement on the gender digital divide through this report, this is the first year in a few years where we're actually seeing some gaps narrowing, which is really exciting.
So even during COVID, which, was spurred a lot of the acceleration of digitization, let's say, women have not budged in mobile ownership.
So what happened during COVID? So I think the important data indicator for what happened during COVID and looking at what the difference between men and women is that gender gap. And so what we saw during COVID was massive investments and acceleration of digitization all over the world. I think it's pretty well documented, but we could dig into kind of what happened and how that happened. But what we saw was that men got access to that rapid digitization much more than women. So women were getting online more. And we did see increases in the number of phones owned and the mobile internet used. But what we didn't see was women increasing their use at the rate that men were increasing theirs. And so what we found was that the digital systems that exist were existing and working much better for men who have many less structural inequalities and barriers that are preventing them from accessing and using in powerful ways digital technologies and entrance into the digital economy than women. So it wasn't that women weren't kind of increasing their inclusion, but just not at the same rate. And so the gap was increasing.
I see. And sorry, I interrupted you. You were going through some of the stats of the GSMA report.
Yeah, just a couple of ones about the good news in the report is that the gender gap in smartphone ownership, which is critically important for really connecting into digital opportunities, across low and middle income countries, that smartphone ownership gap has narrowed from 15% to 13%. It's not huge, but it's something, and I think we'll take it. So 60% of women in low and middle income countries now own a smartphone, but that's still compared to 69% of men. So that's still a 9 percentage point gap. And Women's rate of mobile internet adoption also increased over the last year. So now there are more women using mobile internet in countries than ever before, 60% of women, but that's still compared to 78% of men. So, this is the first time that we've seen mobile internet adoption in low and middle income countries narrow for women since 2020. So for the first time in a few years, the rate of women's adoption is increasing faster relative to men. So this is really, really good news.
So this is great, Jamie. So can you tell us a little bit about how the foundation is working to close the gender digital divide in developing countries?
Yes, great. So what we've seen, especially through things like this GSMA mobile gender gap report and kind of our research of the field overall and the trends and data, is that the existing ecosystem working on digital inclusion and women's equality through digital inclusion has done a really good job of describing the problem and motivating like the potential benefits of closing the divide, but is not moving fast enough or clearly enough to surface in advance definitive answers to what works to really close that divide. So back when we pitched to Bill and Melinda, our co-chairs, that we wanted to launch this learning agenda, they challenged us and said, okay, show us how you think the Gates Foundation can make a meaningful impact on such a significant problem with limited resources. So our learning agenda is aiming to rise up to that challenge, answer that question, and fill that gap that we're seeing between the problems and the solutions. So our focus is on finding solutions that can meaningfully connect, attract, and retain unconnected and underconnected women in order to do two things. The first is inform and accelerate the impact of all of our program teams across the foundation. The second is to help shape the investments of other funders and other work of stakeholders in the ecosystem, mobilizing the sector to adopt evidence-based solutions so that we can close that gap, that problem solution gap. And we want to do this in a way, Romina, that moves us away from this binary of who has a phone and who doesn't have a phone, who has internet access and who doesn't have internet access. Not really a yes/no question. We're taking at the foundation, through the learning agenda, a much more nuanced and intersectional approach to understanding women's meaningful digital connectivity. So we're organizing ourselves around 6 core barriers to women's digital connectivity. And those are access, and that's access to the phone, that's access to the internet, that's access to broadband and computers, all access and all the way to digital systems, affordability of those same tools and systems, digital literacy, relevance, so the relevance of the products, tools, systems where women would connect digitally, safety and security, that's in online life, and also the safety and security of the systems themselves. And then, of course, normative barriers. So what we've done is developed a set of foundational learning questions where we feel like there are big data and evidence gaps around organizing ourselves around those 6 key barriers, and then trying to create from that an evidence-based agenda for the field and the partnerships that we would develop both internally and externally to more accurately quantify and understand the drivers that are preventing ownership and productive use of internet and devices, both for women's economic empowerment outcomes, so for sure for their livelihoods, but also their health outcomes too. These are critical tools for all kinds of different health outcomes as well. So with those learning questions as our anchor, we're making investments that focus on generating better and more actionable data and developing employing gender intentional digital tools and scalable interventions. So we are not even yet 2 years into the learning agenda. And I should say learning agendas are kind of like starter, smaller initiatives that are created at the foundation before larger program strategy teams like our agricultural development team or our polio team, our inclusive financial systems teams are. So these are kind of exploratory agendas that are created. And we're 2 years into the learning agenda, and my team's current portfolio currently includes 58 investments across 34 countries, with the majority of those in India, Kenya, and Nigeria, and a small handful of larger global partnerships. But as you were alluding to, I think in your question, Romina, the reality is that the work at the foundation is not on digital connectivity for women and girls, is not solely centered and driven from my little tiny learning agenda team. We are a tech forward organization at the Gates Foundation. And in so many ways, and right now, dozens of our teams, really, we have over 25 different program strategy teams at the foundation right now that are using or promoting digital tools to achieve their impact goals.
Across the board.
Across the board. So what we did when we started the learning agenda is we took the time to do that landscaping internally. Let's look inside our own house to know where are we focused and how are we trying to leverage these tools? What's preventing us from being able to do so in the most impactful ways? What are the resources that would be required to understand and address the differences in how those tools can be used to support women and how they're being accessed by women relative to men who we're trying to serve? And let's partner together to try to address it together. And so by doing so, we're able to advance these goals in a multiplicative way. It's not one little learning agenda. It's all hands on deck trying to do it together. So we partner with the family planning team, with the neglected tropical diseases team, with the global education team, the agricultural development team, of course, our women's economic empowerment team and our inclusive financial systems teams, also new teams like the digital public infrastructure team and the artificial intelligence team, which is now a kind of exploratory function that we have at the foundation as well. And we think that partnering with those teams to advance this agenda, as well as partners out in the ecosystem, that's the best and maybe only way to really accelerate the pace of change and to rise to the challenge that the co-chairs presented to us about what can we do about this.
Wonderful. So we spoke a little bit about, these 6 barriers: access, affordability, literacy, products being relevant, safety and security, normative barriers. What do you think are some of the successes over the last years in terms of closing the gender digital divide or, women in the digital economy? So maybe you can highlight a little bit, what the foundation has done or, any success stories.
Yeah, I'd love to do it. So the use of digital technologies for women's empowerment, especially in access to financial services and access to finance that can unlock women's economic potential, have proven now several times to be a motivator of growth, of potential, a pathway out of poverty. I think there's been some pretty foundational work that's been done on digital inclusion and the role of that in women's full participation in the digital economy. And we have estimates that say that this is a multi-trillion-dollar economic opportunity to correct for women's economic participation and having their full participation in global and digital economies. And I think it's been said before, and maybe I even said it in this podcast, but we are leaving progress and economic opportunity and development on the table every day that there is a divide, a gender digital divide and an economic divide between men and women. But that's really at the macro level. At the individual level, we see how very impactful digital tools can be for women. They have the ability to significantly enhance their economic power by providing them with ways to manage their finances and tools, access to information, and connect with markets and networks. Mobile money is, of course, the most common example for this, and an example that I know personally very well. And it really has been a game changer. It's allowing women to manage their daily financial transactions and save for the futures. But now with new systems like digital public infrastructure and digital platforms, we can facilitate and accelerate access to financial services even more rapidly and more deeply. And, that looks like access to credit, enabling small business growth, offering access to educational and learning opportunities for women and their children. And, things like digital identification as a means of digital public infrastructure is giving women even more and more equal access to these systems. These services can help them get access to all kinds of benefits and access to capital and other assets for their economic inclusion and their power. And that's really, really foundational and important. Even with things like digital ID, where, we're seeing really amazing advances, the commonly called the jam trinity of ID payments and data in India is kind of the benchmark for digital public infrastructure globally. Even there, we're still seeing massive gender gaps in access to and use of those digital IDs. And so it's progress, but it's still not quite enough. And so I think we're still looking for how to, now that we see the potential that those different systems can have, what can we do to really ensure that women have access to them?
Yeah, on the digital ID and ID in general, people don't know, that it's such an important tool to access if you want to access a smartphone, or if you want to open a bank account, you need to prove who you are. And a lot of the women that are born in developing countries go, I wouldn't say ghost, but they're not given this ID, which is such an important tool to access other services, right? And you were talking about, the impacts of this gender digital divide earlier. I pulled up a little bit of some stats. UN Women calculated that $1 trillion were left on the table in the past decade because women were excluded in the digital economy. Mm-hmm. So this is an important issue that you guys are working on. And, I think this is great. And I'm sorry I interrupted. You were telling us a little bit about success stories.
No, I think it's such an important thing to keep saying out loud, that it's important in its own right to ensure that that's equal access and equal opportunity to this digital future that we are all moving into for all kinds of different reasons. But it's also a huge macroeconomic imperative.
Yeah,
really an imperative to ensure that women are also able to participate in the global economy. So I really appreciate that you pulled that up in the work that the UN Women have been doing to continue to surface and advocate for that. Beyond digital public infrastructure, or when you have digital public infrastructure, there's so much that then is possible once those infrastructure enable more and cheaper access to things like mobile internet and smartphones. And some of the things that we're working on are testing some of the solutions that new technologies and what we call frontier technologies might be able to provide once those things are in place, to make sure that these systems are gender equal and that the benefits accrued from them are also gender equal to men and women. So things like AI-enabled voice technology, upskilling systems, chatbots, things like that can be created in very context-specific ways by smaller firms and large firms. We can see that globally. The largest companies in the world are trying to figure out how to advance these different technologies in different ways. And we're seeing that in the work that we're doing as well. And I thought I could give you one example from our portfolio. And one of our first grantees for this digital connectivity learning agenda is a startup. They call themselves an ethical AI startup called Karya, which was incubated by some incredible people out of Microsoft Research India. And we funded an effort out of Karya called Project Sanmati, which has the objective to employ women in low-income communities, paying attractive wages, which is rare for data annotation and data collection jobs globally. So paying actual competitive and attractive wages to mitigate gender bias in AI data sets in 6 Indian languages. So these large language models that we all talk about that are fueling the AI data sets, today, they are not inclusive of most low and middle income country languages. And Karya is creating these pathways both to more formal employment and shifting norms around digital work for women and their participation in digital data and the data economy, while also creating language data sets where the data is currently sparse or not available, but is incredibly valuable. And one of the things that they're doing that is very cool as part of this project is also through the creation of the data sets, very intentionally embedding in research to understand where gender bias comes up and how in those 6 Indian languages, so that we can understand that better, so that we can correct for those biases in the data sets as they're used to develop the algorithms. And so this is incredibly cool stuff. The early research on it has been super promising.
One thing that I've read also is that a lot of the AI jobs or STEM, ICT related jobs, women do not have access to those jobs,
That's
which
right.
also creates that bias. So I guess that you guys are working with organizations that are also employing women so that they can be not perpetrating these biases. Well, that's what I was, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a critical issue when you look at why these biases exist in the systems that are there. Oftentimes because those who are creating the systems are not women. And it's intersectional too. I mean, also the fact that generative AI and the large language models are built almost entirely on the English language,
right,
and men's voices. And like you start to see all the different ways that these types of biases and just exclusions can layer up. And we think there's clearly very important and new ways that we can address that challenge. And I think that we're seeing that happen. The momentum's in the right direction. We want it to go faster. We think that we need to correct for that issue much faster than we are right now. And so getting these large language models, like the data sets fueled by women's voices, so that when women speak into a chatbot, their voices are understood, not just their language, but a woman's voice is also understood, so that we can be creating solutions that work for women. So getting to that relevancy barrier, and that create digital confidence and fluency. So getting at the digital literacy barrier, that make these tools more meaningful and useful for women, so that when they try to use them, once they get the opportunity and ability to do so, it actually is something where they see themselves, and they see themselves as, this is a useful tool for me. This is a digital world that I belong in. And so that's the goal.
Right. As you were mentioning, the relevance, of these tools for women. So, Jamie, you were talking a little bit about, that you work on the ground with partners, but you also work in the United States with U.S. development agencies such as USAID, multilaterals, the World Bank, the UN. Yeah. So, what would you like to see from the U.S.? What can the U.S. do more? I know it's a big topic, but do more on this space of closing the digital gender divide. Where do you think, what are our value add? What's the U.S. value add? And where can the U.S. do more?
Yeah, institutions in the U.S. And so, if we're talking about U.S.-based institutions overall, so private sector, government, philanthropy, the multilaterals, regardless, I think they all have a role to play. Like if you are touching digital tools in any way whatsoever in your programming, in your policy, in your regulatory work, in the products and services that you are trying to build business models and solutions for, you should be thinking about whether they work for women and girls. So that at a broad level, I think there's a pivotal role to play across all kinds of institutions here. But I was thinking about this, Romina, because the last time that we spoke, a few months ago, when we were together, we talked about a partnership that the Gates Foundation is in with the US government called the Women in the Digital Economy Fund. And so just for those who were not with us for that great event that you hosted then, the Women in the Digital Economy Fund was announced by Vice President Harris about a year ago now in Ghana in her first official visit to sub-Saharan Africa. It was launched as a $60 million initiative between the U.S. government and championed by the White House's Gender Policy Council and Vice President Harris, but housed in USAID. So a partnership between USAID and the Gates Foundation. And the goal of this fund is to accelerate closure of the gender digital divide, of course, but through both a fund mechanism where we get resources to entities, private sector, NGOs, et cetera, in the markets where the divide is so stark, and support them to scale proven and evidence-based solutions, as well as build through this initiative a coalition of other institutions, both in the US and outside the US, to coalesce around what works, what needs to happen, what needs to change, so that we can have a united voice in advocating for the most important solutions and tools. So the USG has been an incredible partner. U.S. government's been an incredible partner in setting up this fund, putting their money where their mouth is in terms of funding the fund, but also, beyond that. So not only putting their money where their mouth is for the Women in the Digital Economy Fund, but also putting their mouth where the money is in terms of advocating for more resources and more commitment for closing the gender digital divide in other fora where the US government exercises some incredible power. So for instance, the G20 process that was led by the Indian government last year, for the first time ever, we were able to, and by we, I mean, the global coalition, but through the leadership really of the US government, got into the leader statement at the G20, a commitment to have the gender digital divide really aligned to these different closing and addressing these different barriers that we've been talking about today by 2030. So this was extremely exciting to see. It's not a guarantee of a massive investment to make it happen, but it is a start, and it's a powerful tool to put it on the agenda and say, okay, let's get serious about this. So beyond funding programs and partnerships and continuing the strong advocacy, those are all really important elements of what US institutions and especially the US government can do to support and address the divide. There are a couple other things that I would really love to see US institutions taking on, and that's investing in the infrastructure, particularly in inclusive digital public infrastructure, as well as the connectivity infrastructure that can level the playing field for affordable and accessible connectivity. So digital public infrastructure, DPI, I've talked about it a couple times already. This is a big deal. It will require significant resources to deploy well.
So ID, digital payments, data, systems, those three components. Yep.
Yes. Those as the anchor. And then there's so much that you can layer on once you have those foundational pieces in place. Absolutely. And so that I'd love to see, investing in the infrastructure. And then the second is really doubling down on innovative solutions. I'd love the private sector to do more to design and deploy the digital tools, ideally developed with, by, and for women and the historically underserved in the communities that we're talking about, to address the specific needs and challenges that women face. And this should go without saying, but they should also do so in a way that tests and acknowledges and corrects for bias, exclusion, and very real gender differences in the risks and harms that are experienced online. The private sector has the most to gain, and so they have the biggest responsibility for making sure that this is working well for women. So the bottom line here is that if you're an institution with and or using digital tools or systems, really, and you should be focused on women and girls in what you do.
So, Jamie, we began our conversation with your career, and you've been, working on these issues: financial inclusion, now, digitization, women's economic empowerment for quite a bit of time. So let me ask you more of a personal question. What still keeps you up at night about, this topic? Maybe the word frustration is not the best word, but, like you get up and you're like, this still has not been solved. So what is that challenge? And then on the flip side, what gives you hope?
Yeah. Okay. So what keeps me up at night? So many things, but I think a couple of things that are sticking with me most. And one is the pace of change. Change is happening, but not fast enough. I think you can hear in my voice a real urgency that the technologies are moving faster than our efforts to ensure inclusion and utility and use of those technologies for everyone. I think it's a huge challenge. And there have been significant efforts, there have been investments, but still, as we were talking about earlier, hundreds of millions of women remain unconnected and underconnected. And this is limiting their opportunities for economic and social empowerment, for using these tools, for supporting their families, their children's education, ensuring a healthy and productive life. That's the core. And I think related to that is the risk of digital technologies exacerbating existing inequalities, if not intentionally designed and deployed. So even with all of the desire to ensure that women have access to the systems, if we don't correct for bias, barriers, and potential harms, we run the risk of exacerbating the divides that are out there and the inequalities that we see. So it's a quick story, at the 2023 Commission on the Status of Women in New York. And that year, the theme was around technology and digital inclusion for women. And throughout the whole event, throughout the week, the conversation was super abuzz with the discussion about AI, of course, very hot topic now and then, and how we're essentially coding bias into the system. And as I see the world kind of backsliding on gender equality on lots of different measures, not just on the gender digital divide, I am increasingly concerned that there are technologies that could perpetuate and exacerbate exclusion or bias, and we can't accept that. So that said, I am still incredibly optimistic. There are a lot of things that give me hope, more things that give me hope than that keep me up at night. So I'll say that out loud. And one of which is the growing recognition of the importance of gender equality and digital access by the global stakeholders and very influential people and institutions that are able to make change. And from that, the number of collaborative efforts that we're seeing to kind of put all hands on deck and rally around the issue. So, I talked about the work of CARIA. There are amazing technologists like Manu Chopra and his team at CARIA, but also folks like Dr. Joy Wolamwini, who are popularizing in the public discourse conversations on ethical and inclusive artificial intelligence, just as an example. The work of Vice President Harris and the Gender Policy Council of the US government that we just talked about is prioritizing closing the gender digital divide as a policy priority. And this is, the first time that we've really seen that level of momentum behind this issue. And of course, there's Melinda French Gates. And we are, elephant in the room, moving into a new era at the foundation in which she is leaving us and moving and starting a new world for herself as a leader on this issue of women's equality and women's empowerment and gender equality. And it's super sad, especially for those of us, for all of us, but of course, those of us in the gender equality division, to see her time end after almost 25 years of leadership at the foundation. But seeing her put the full weight of her passion and power towards gender equality and women's inclusion and empowerment, that fuels my optimism that we're going to have a bright future for gender equality in women and girls.
Wonderful. Yes, I wish her the best because she's been an incredible leader on these issues. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to what she does next. So with that, Jamie, I want to thank you for this podcast and for the incredible work that you're doing. And I want to thank the audience. So have a good day, and we'll hear more from these issues in our work.
Great. Thanks, Romina. Nice to see you again.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog